ever noticed how the same words that devastate you barely touch someone else? How rejection that sends you into a spiral of self-doubt is something another person simply shrugs off and moves on from? Or how betrayal that makes you question your entire existence is just a life lesson they file away and forget about by tomorrow? You've always assumed it was just personality, that some people are naturally stronger, more resilient, less sensitive than you. But that's not what's actually happening. What's really happening is far more sinister and far more fixable. Someone just said something that shattered your entire week. A single comment, a glance, a tone of voice, and suddenly you're replaying it in your mind at 3 a.m., constructing scenarios where you deliver the perfect comeback, defending yourself against words that were never meant to wound you as deeply as they did. The person who said it has probably already forgotten, but you're still bleeding. That's the thing about being emotionally reactive. You give away your power the moment someone else decides to hold your pain. And most of us have been doing this our entire lives. We've trained ourselves to be hostages to other people's moods, opinions, and unpredictability. We've become slaves to circumstances we cannot control, and we call it sensitivity. We call it depth. We call it caring. But what it really is fragility dressed up in noble language. Here's what most people don't understand. Emotional invincibility isn't about becoming cold or untouchable. It's not about suppressing your feelings or building walls so high that nothing can reach you. That's just a different kind of prison. Real emotional invincibility is about something far more radical. It's about becoming so aware of your own internal landscape that nothing external has permission to navigate it. If you've ever felt like the world has power over you that you don't fully understand, if you've ever wondered why some people seem unshakable while others crumble under the slightest pressure, this is the moment everything changes. Because what I'm about to show you isn't theory. It's the nervous system rewiring that changes how you experience every single moment from this point forward. This isn't about positive thinking. This isn't about affirmations. This is about confronting what psychiatrist Rollo May called the existential reality of human freedom. The terrifying fact that you are responsible for your own emotional state and no one can do that work for you. And that responsibility, once fully embraced, becomes your greatest source of power. Let's begin. You think the problem is external. Someone hurt you, someone betrayed you, someone looked at you with disdain, and that's why you're suffering now. It's a logical conclusion. It feels true, but it's not the actual source of your pain, and this is where most people get it catastrophically wrong. Psychologist Alfred Adler spent decades understanding human motivation, and he discovered something that most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid. The wound behind every wound is always internal. When someone criticizes you and you feel decimated, it's not really their words doing the damage. It's the part of you that already believed those words to be true. It's the silent agreement you made with yourself long ago that you weren't quite enough, that you were deficient in some way, that you needed approval to be valid. Think about it. Two people hear the exact same criticism. One flinches for a moment, processes it, and asks themselves if there's anything worth learning. The other person spirals. They obsess. They reconstruct their entire self-image around those 10 seconds of someone else's judgment. Why? Because for the second person, that criticism didn't land on neutral ground. It landed on a wound that was already open. It found a crack that was already there, and it poured salt into it. This is the brutal truth that nobody tells you. You are not actually suffering because of what happened to you. You're suffering because of what those events activated inside you. You're suffering because somewhere in your nervous system, there's a story playing on loop. A story that says you're not worthy, that you're fundamentally flawed, that if people really knew you, they would leave. And every time someone says something that even vaguely echoes that story, your entire being goes into alarm mode. Adler called this the inferiority complex, but it's far more nuanced than that. It's not just about feeling inferior. It's about the core belief system that determines how you interpret everything that happens to you. Someone forgets to text you back, and your wounded self interprets it as abandonment. Someone gets a promotion instead of you, and your wounded self interprets it as confirmation that you'll never be good enough. Someone looks at you a certain way, and your wounded self interprets it as judgment. The external event is neutral. Your interpretation is where the suffering lives. Here's what changes everything. The moment you understand that your pain is coming from inside you, not from outside, you reclaim your power. Because while you cannot control what other people do, while you cannot control the unpredictable chaos of the world, you can absolutely control what you choose to believe about yourself. You can examine those stories, you can question them, you can decide whether they're actually true or whether they're just old survival mechanisms that no longer serve you. The person who seems unshakable isn't unshakable because they don't feel things. They're unshakable because they've already done the work of understanding their wounds. They know their stories. They've looked directly at their own inferiority complex and said, I see you, but you don't get to write my entire narrative. And that clarity, that internal knowledge, is the first pillar of emotional invincibility. Most people never do this work. They spend their entire lives running from their own wounds, trying to outrun them through achievement, through people-pleasing, through perfectionism, through control. But you can't outrun something that lives inside you. Eventually, it catches up. And when it does, it disguises itself as anxiety, as anger, as toxic patterns you can't seem to break, as relationships that repeat the same painful cycle over and over. But you're not here to repeat. You're here to understand. And that understanding begins the moment you stop blaming the world for your suffering and start investigating what inside you is actually creating the suffering. Let me tell you something that most therapists won't say directly. Your triggers are not problems to be solved. They're messages. They're the nervous system's way of pointing at exactly where the real work needs to happen. And the people who become emotionally invincible aren't the ones who suppress their triggers. They're the ones who learn to read them. Viktor Frankl, who survived the concentration camps and went on to understand the human search for meaning, said something that cuts right to the heart of this. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space lies our freedom and our power to choose our response. But here's what most people don't realize. You can't use that space until you actually know your triggers. You can't choose a different response until you understand what's actually being triggered. When someone says something that makes you feel small, your first instinct is usually to defend, to attack, to prove them wrong, to make them understand how wrong they are. But that's not actually happening in the moment. What's happening is your nervous system is activating an old survival pattern. It's responding as if it's back in the original moment when you learned to feel small. Maybe it was a parent who criticized you. Maybe it was a peer who rejected you. Maybe it was a teacher who made you feel stupid. Doesn't matter. The point is that your nervous system recorded that moment and it created a protective strategy. Now, every time something remotely similar happens, your nervous system hijacks your conscious mind. It takes over, it makes you reactive. And in that reactive state, you're not actually responding to what's happening now. You're responding to what happened then. You're fighting a ghost. You're defending against an enemy that's already dead. This is why emotionally invincible people don't seem rattled. It's not because they don't get triggered. It's because they've learned to recognize the moment the trigger is activated. They've learned to create distance between the trigger and their response. They feel the reaction coming, and instead of acting on it, they pause. They observe it. They ask themselves, is this really about what's happening right now, or is this an old story playing again? That pause is everything. That space is where your freedom lives. Here's a practical example of how this works. Someone criticizes your work in front of other people. Immediately, you feel heat rising in your chest. Your face gets hot. You want to either defend yourself aggressively or disappear. Your nervous system is screaming danger. But if you've done the work of understanding your wounds, if you know that criticism activates your fear of not being good enough, you can actually use that moment differently. You can feel the reaction. You can acknowledge it. My nervous system is interpreting this as a threat to my worth. You can take a breath. You can ask yourself, is that actually true? Is one piece of criticism actually evidence that I'm not good enough? Or is my nervous system using this as evidence to confirm a story I've been telling myself for 20 years? Usually, once you ask yourself that question, the intensity of the reaction shifts. It doesn't disappear, but it loses its grip on you. This is what Frankl meant by that space. That space is where you get to choose. Do I believe this interpretation of events, or do I want to consider other interpretations? Do I want to react from fear, or do I want to respond from clarity? The person you're talking to, the rejection you just experienced, the disappointment you're feeling, none of it changes, but your relationship to it changes completely. The invincible person isn't the one who doesn't feel triggered. The invincible person is the one who has trained themselves to notice the trigger, to watch it play out without being completely consumed by it, and to choose a response that's actually aligned with who they are now, not who they were when the wound was created. This is the second pillar of emotional invincibility, and it cannot be developed without actually understanding your own nervous system. You have to get curious about yourself. What makes you react? What comments send you spiraling? What situations make you feel small or powerless? Don't avoid these questions. Lean into them, because every single trigger is pointing you toward a place where you're still giving your power away. Every trigger is showing you exactly where you're still operating from an old fear, an old belief, an old survival mechanism that doesn't actually serve you anymore. Here's where it gets really uncomfortable. Most people think that becoming emotionally strong means becoming harder. It means building walls. It means learning to not care. They think emotional invincibility looks like detachment, like someone who has transcended feeling altogether, who can walk through life untouched by what happens around them. But that's not invincibility, that's dissociation. And dissociation might feel like strength for a while, but it's actually one of the most fragile states you can be in. Psychoanalyst Erich Fromm wrote extensively about how we escape from our own freedom, how we build elaborate defenses to protect ourselves from the reality of being conscious, feeling human beings. And one of the most common defenses is emotional numbness. We think that if we stop feeling, we'll stop hurting. But what actually happens is that we stop living. We become ghosts, walking around in our own lives. Think about the people you know who seem like they don't care about anything. They're always making jokes about serious things. They never get visibly upset. They give the impression that nothing can touch them. Have you noticed how often those people also seem somehow empty? How even when things are supposedly good, there's a flatness to them. That's what happens when you choose armor over authenticity. You survive, but you don't actually live. You protect yourself from pain, but you also protect yourself from joy, from connection, from anything real. The problem with building walls is that you end up trapped inside them. The protection that was supposed to keep threats out also keeps you in. You become so defended that you can't actually connect with other people. You can't be vulnerable enough to be truly seen. And human beings need to be seen. We need that recognition from others. We need to know that we're not alone in our experience. When you seal yourself off in the name of protection, you cut yourself off from the very thing that would actually heal you. But here's what's really sinister about armor. It always fails, eventually. You can maintain the facade for only so long before the cracks start showing. And when those cracks do show, all the pain you've been storing up comes pouring out at once. It's like a dam breaking. You've been holding back your humanity, and at some point you just can't hold it anymore. This is why people with strong emotional armor sometimes snap unexpectedly. This is why they might seem fine one moment and completely unstable the next. It's not because they're weak, it's because the system they built was unsustainable from the beginning. Emotional invincibility isn't about armor. It's about the opposite. It's about integration. It's about feeling everything fully and knowing that you can survive it. It's about walking directly into the abyss of your own emotions and discovering that the abyss doesn't actually kill you. It just changes you. This is terrifying. This is why most people never do it, because it requires you to let yourself be vulnerable, It requires you to actually feel the pain you've been running from. It requires you to sit with sadness, with fear, with shame, with anger, and to not try to fix it or escape it or numb it away. You just feel it. You let it move through you. And here's what happens when you finally do that. It moves. It doesn't stay static. It doesn't calcify. It doesn't become a permanent part of your nervous system. It processes, it releases, and on the other side of feeling it completely is a kind of freedom that armor could never give you. The invincible person isn't the one who doesn't feel. The invincible person is the one who has felt so deeply, so completely, that they're no longer afraid of their own emotions. They know that sadness won't destroy them. They know that fear won't consume them. They know that anger won't make them lose control. They've been in the abyss, and they're still standing. That's invincibility. That's real strength. This is why I need you to understand something right now, because this is where most people quit. If this is making sense to you, if something inside you is recognizing the truth in what I'm saying, you need to subscribe. Because what comes next requires commitment. It requires you to be willing to feel things you've been running from. It requires you to dismantle the defenses that have kept you safe, but also kept you small. And I'm going to walk you through exactly how to do that. Subscribe now, because the next video in this series is where the actual transformation begins. We're taught from childhood to be someone, not to be ourselves, but to be someone. We're taught that there's a version of ourselves that's acceptable and a version that needs to be hidden. We're taught that love is conditional, that we need to earn acceptance, that we're not okay as we are. So we start performing. We create a self that we think other people will like. We suppress the parts that might be rejected. We build an elaborate persona that says, "This is the version of me that's safe. This is the version of me that won't be abandoned." Philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre called this bad faith, the state of lying to ourselves about who we really are. And most of us spend our entire lives in bad faith. We're performing constantly. We're never actually present. We're always calculating. What does this person want to hear? What should I say to get approval? What needs to stay hidden so I don't get judged? It's exhausting. It's also the primary source of emotional fragility. Because here's the thing. When you build your entire emotional stability on the foundation of other people's approval, you're building on sand. Their approval is never guaranteed. People change their minds, people forget about you, people find someone else more interesting, and the moment their approval starts slipping, your entire sense of self begins to crumble. You're not invincible, you're hypervigilant. You're constantly monitoring other people's reactions, constantly adjusting your behavior, constantly terrified that the real you will be discovered and rejected. This is the mechanism that keeps most people in a state of emotional dependence. This is why they're so easily triggered. They're not actually responding to what's happening. They're responding to the threat of their real self being exposed. Every criticism feels like a threat to the persona. Every rejection feels like confirmation that the real them isn't good enough. But what happens when you actually let the persona die? What happens when you stop performing and you just start being? This is the scariest part. This is where people usually give up. Because the truth is, not everyone will like the real you. Some people will judge you, some people will leave. And that's not a failure. That's actually freedom. That's you filtering for people who actually like you, not people who like the character you've been playing. When you stop performing, something radical shifts in your nervous system. Because you're no longer spending energy on maintaining the facade. You're no longer in constant threat mode. You're no longer hypervigilant about what other people think. You're actually present. And presence is the most powerful force there is. Because from that place of presence, you can actually see what's really happening instead of seeing everything through the lens of threat. People respond to that presence. They can feel the difference between someone who's performing and someone who's actually real. They might not like the real you, and that's their choice, and it's okay. But the people who do like the real you, those are your people. Those are the relationships that actually nourish you. because they're based on reality instead of illusion. You're no longer exhausted from performing. You're no longer terrified of being discovered. You're just living. This is where emotional invincibility becomes visible to the outside world. This is where people look at you and think, they seem so calm, so grounded, so unshakable. They don't realize that what they're seeing is what happens when someone stops performing and starts being. They don't realize that the strength they're witnessing is actually just authenticity. And here's what's wild. Once you make this shift, you become so much harder to hurt. Not because you're defended, not because you don't care, but because you're no longer trying to control what other people think about you. You're no longer desperate for their approval. You've already approved of yourself. You've already decided that you're worth something, not because of achievement or approval or performance, but just because you exist. And from that foundation, nothing external can shake you. This is the ultimate invincibility. Not armor, not numbness, not detachment. Just honest, grounded authenticity. Just being willing to be seen as you actually are and knowing that you can survive the response, whatever it is. We are not born conscious. Consciousness is built. It's developed. It's constructed through repetition, through awareness, through the willingness to see what you've been refusing to see. And every single person who seems to have emotional invincibility has built it through this process. They've invested in consciousness. Most people remain unconscious their entire lives. They walk through the world on autopilot, reacting without knowing why, feeling emotions without understanding their source, making decisions that sabotage them, and then wondering why they keep repeating the same patterns. Their lives are being run by the unconscious, and they're calling it fate. They're calling it bad luck. They're calling it who they are. But it's none of those things. It's just unconsciousness. Philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer said something that cuts right to the heart of this. Man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills. What he meant is that most people are slaves to their own unconscious programming. They do things without actually choosing them. They feel ways without actually understanding why. They're being driven by forces they can't see, and they think they're making free choices. The moment you wake up to this, the moment you actually start building consciousness, everything changes. Because consciousness is power. It's the ability to see what's actually happening instead of what you think is happening. It's the ability to notice patterns instead of just repeating them. It's the ability to choose your response instead of just reacting. Here's what consciousness does. It separates the observer from the observed. When you're unconscious, you are completely identified with your emotions. You feel angry and you think you are anger. You feel afraid and you think you are fear. You feel rejected and you think you are worthless. There's no distance. The emotion and the self are the same thing. But the moment you develop consciousness, something shifts. You can feel angry and observe the anger at the same time. You can feel fear and ask yourself, where is this coming from? You can feel rejected without the rejection meaning anything about your inherent worth. This is the space where power lives. This is where choice becomes possible. This is where you stop being a puppet of your own nervous system and start being the master of it. Consciousness is built through simple practices that most people never do. It's built through noticing. Every time you feel an emotion, instead of acting on it, you pause and you ask yourself, what's actually happening right now? What am I interpreting this as? Where have I felt this way before? What old story is being activated? This practice, done consistently, builds consciousness, and consciousness builds invincibility. Because once you're conscious of your patterns, you can't help but change them. You can't see yourself repeating a self-sabotaging cycle and just keep doing it. You can't see yourself getting triggered by the same things over and over without eventually understanding why. Consciousness doesn't let you off the hook. It demands that you wake up. And waking up is the only path to actual freedom. The person who seems unshakable, they're not unshakable because they're enlightened or special or born with some superpower. They're unshakable because they've invested in consciousness. They've built awareness. They've done the work of understanding themselves, their patterns, their wounds, their triggers. They've faced their own darkness and made peace with it. And from that place of integrated consciousness, the external world has lost the power to destabilize them. This is not mystical. This is not esoteric. This is practical neuroscience. This is the result of rewiring your nervous system through awareness and repetition. This is what becomes possible when you commit to seeing clearly. You came here looking for a way to stop hurting. You came here hoping that someone would finally tell you how to become the kind of person who can't be broken by the world. And here's what I've shown you. That person isn't someone who has built walls. That person isn't someone who has transcended feeling. That person is someone who has decided to face everything inside themselves that they've been running from. And that person is someone who has looked at their wounds and decided to understand them instead of pretending they don't exist. That person is someone who has felt their emotions completely instead of numbing them away. That person is someone who has killed the performing self and decided to just be real. That person is someone who has invested in consciousness, who has built awareness, who has woken up to the fact that they've been living on autopilot. If you've made it this far, it's because you're ready for this. It's because some part of you knows that this is true and it's been waiting for permission to actually change. Well, here's your permission. Stop waiting, stop performing, stop running from your own internal landscape. Start looking, start feeling, start building consciousness. The invincibility you're looking for isn't something that happens to you. It's something you build, and the only person who can build it is you. If this has spoken to you, if something inside you has awakened, leave a comment below. Tell me what shifted for you in hearing this. Tell me what part of your internal landscape you're ready to face. Because we're building a community here of people who are sick of pretending to be strong. People who are ready to actually be strong, which means being real. And don't forget, subscribe to this channel. Because the next video is going to take everything we've discussed here and show you the exact methodology for how to actually implement this. How to move from understanding to action. How to start rewiring your nervous system today. Real transformation doesn't happen in one video. It happens when you commit to the process, and I'm going to be here guiding you through every step of it. You need to keep going, because nothing changes if you stop here. See you in the next one.